We'll just give folks a little bit
Right.
of time to join, and then we'll get started. I'm not seeing any more people joining, so perhaps we might take this opportunity to get started. Let me just figure out my screens here for a minute. So good evening and welcome to the third Just Futures Roundtable. My name is Ngoni Munemo. I'm a professor of political science, chair of global studies, and the administrative director of the Williams Just Future project. We're a partner in this Mellon Just Futures project, which also involves Williams Mystic program of Williams College, Brown University, and the Mystic Seaport Museum. By way of getting us started, I want to share a land acknowledgement. We respectfully acknowledge that Williams College stands on the ancestral homes of the Stockreed-Munsee Mohicans.
Yes.
We are the indigenous.
What's that?
We are the indigenous people who are the indigenous peoples of the region now called Williamstown. Following tremendous hardship after being forced from their valued homelands, they continued as a sovereign tribal nation in Wisconsin, which is where they reside today. We pay honor and respect to their ancestors past and present as we commit to building a more inclusive and equitable space for all. I also want to thank my Williams colleagues, Professor Joy James, Professor Christine DeLucia, Tom Van Winkle, and Michelle Dempsey for the work to establish this roundtable series. As you have seen, we've entitled these series Entwined, modeled after the brilliant work of our Mystic Seaport Museum colleagues. The theme Entwined is a term that was co-developed by Dr. Aquinnah Gomes, Senior Curator of Maritime Social Histories, and an advisory board of community members from several different walks of life. This group collectively framed Entwined to embody Indigenous, African, Afro-Indigenous, African-American spirituality and sovereignty. This roundtable series owes a great deal to many colleagues and collaborators, including the Just Futures Project, the Oakley Center here at Williams College, the Office of Institutional Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and the Pathways for Inclusive Excellence program. And of course, to our IT team for their technical support. We extend our tremendous appreciation to our presenters this evening, as well as to you attendees for taking the time to join us in this space for conversation, learning, and exchange. While we wish we could have had the opportunity to gather in person, we're grateful for a virtual gathering that can bring together many people located across the country. The topic of this evening's roundtable is sovereignties. We've invited 3 participants to reflect on what this means to them and how it shapes their work and experiences as we think about multiple forms of knowledge, systems of value and belonging, sites of power, resistance, critique, and creativity, and approaches to relationality. We are mindful of the ongoing complexities among past, present, and future. Before I introduce our panelists, a quick note about how this session will be run. We'll open with short remarks from each panelist, 8 to 10 minutes, followed by dialogue, as well as questions from attendees. We welcome you to put comments and questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Please also note that this session is being recorded and we will share it out afterwards as a digital resource via our website. You can enable the live transcript of the session by clicking on that button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you'd like to correspond with the project team after this event, we also welcome your emails and the address is melon-justfutures@williams.edu. It is an honor to introduce the members of this roundtable. They each bring deep experience in community-based work, scholarship, activism, and education. I will keep the introductions brief as a way of maximizing our time for conversation and invite you to follow the links on the program to their individual bios if you want to learn a little bit more. I'll introduce our panelists in the order in which they will present, starting first of all with Brad Lopes. Aquinnah Wampanoag is the program director of the Aquinnah Cultural Center located in the territory of the Wampanoag Nation. In the off-season, Brad is also a public school social studies teacher in the Chukwabanakik or Wabanaki territory, otherwise known as Maine. In participation with the Brown Mystic Seaport Partnership, Brad hopes to emphasize the connections between coastal communities from Turtle Island and those in West Africa, and provide a narrative that is centered in the experiences of Indigenous and Black communities. Brad will be followed by Katy Robertson Hall, who's an associate professor at Williams Mystic. Williams Mystic is the Ocean and Coastal Studies program of Williams College and Mystic Seaport Museum, located along the Mystic Estuary in Mystic, Connecticut. Katy teaches marine policy and coastal law. She focuses her students' research on engaging with coastal stakeholders to address current issues affecting our country's coasts and oceans. Katy is also an environmental attorney whose work involves land and water conservation, coastal zone access, and climate change advocacy. Finally, we'll hear from Ernest Tollerson, a journalist by training and a New Yorker by choice. Ernest spent nearly 25 years as a newspaper reporter and editor. His journalism and career included political reporting at the Philadelphia Inquirer, opinion journalism as the editor of the editorial pages of the Times Mirror, New York Newsday, and a stint at the New York Times, where he worked as a national correspondent, an editor on the Metro desk, and a member of the Times editorial board. Post-journalism, Ernest worked for foundations and NGO and held one post in the public sector. He is a former director of the Environmental Sustainability and Compliance at the Metropolitan Transportation Authority, MTA, where he led the work of the Blue Ribbon Commission on Sustainability and the MTA. Excuse me as I scroll down. As a board member, Ernest currently supports 2 regional environmental NGOs, an environmental foundation, and 2 New York-based museums. Ernest chairs the board of Riverkeeper and also serves on the boards of Environmental Advocates in New York, the Regional Plan Association, and the Hudson River Foundation. He's also on the boards of the New York Historical Society and the South Street Seaport Museum. With this, let me turn let us now turn to some reflection on sovereignties. Again, each panelist will speak for about 10 or so minutes, followed by dialogue, and I invite you all to use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to type in any questions you might have for our panelists. With that, let me turn it over to my colleague, Brad.
Katapatosh, thank you. Wuni Wanak, Nutasis Brad Lopes. Good evening, everyone. My name is Brad Lopes. Katapatosh, as well as another word in Wampanoag for thank you. So Katapatush for joining us this evening. I'm going to talk to you all about tribal sovereignty this evening in my area of kind of concern, the area that I am most familiar with. So I would love to talk to you all about this right to tribal sovereignty this evening and this right to self-determination that we as tribal nations have here in what is now the United States, but also what is now known as Mexico, Canada, and elsewhere across the globe. We do not necessarily call these locations those names. For example, I tend to call North America Turtle Island, and the island in which my tribe is from, which many people know of as Martha's Vineyard, is Nopi. That is what we call it, Nopi. So today, one of the things I'd like to share with you all is the fact that there are over 570 federally recognized tribal nations here in what is now the United States. That means that there is no one Native American group. There's actually 570 plus independent sovereign nations within this country's borders. My nation is one of those. In fact, just 2 days ago, we marked our 35th anniversary of being a federally recognized tribal nation here, despite existing in Nopi for over 12,000 years based on archaeological records that we do have. Now, federal recognition is something that happens to a lot of tribal nations as we have sought to extend our sovereignty and ensure that our rights are recognized and that we are respected as people and also the original inhabitants of this land. And yes, we are still here. Some of us are unfortunately not in our homelands, but some of us are. And oftentimes I even encounter people who say they've never met a Native person east of the Mississippi. They thought that we were all gone. And that is far, far, far from true. Today, we are considered under the United States legal code as US domestic sovereign nations. And that phrase is interesting because it's a slight oxymoron to be both domestic and sovereign. Because to be domestic means that we are within the United States and that we in some way are underneath the United States legal jurisdiction. So much so, and some of you may not know this, federally recognized tribes have tribal IDs. So not only do I have a state ID for the state of Maine or a social security number for the federal government, but I also have a tribal ID, which is something that I carry around and use as much as often. And it's hard to see and tricky because of the lighting, but right on the back, it says US domestic sovereign nation. And so you can see right away where it's kind of a consistent reminder of ours. Unfortunately, this is not an even relationship. In fact, the United States legal system and the Supreme Court has actually cited the papal bulls issued by the Pope in a series of decrees in the 1450s and onward as the essential legal justification for the existence of the United States today. In 1823, the papal bulls were cited by the Supreme Court in Johnson v. McIntosh and essentially ruled that Native people here in the United States did not have a right to own land. We only had a right to occupy it. This is something that still today breaks my heart as a Native person, as somebody who's very connected to the land in which I'm a part of. In our language and in our culture, we are part of the land. I said to somebody the other day, there are cliffs, there are clay cliffs that exist in Aquinnah, and they're spiritual, they're a part of us. And I said to somebody the other day, when those cliffs eventually crash into the sea because of erosion and climate change, for many of us, it will feel like the end of the world. And that's true because it's an extension of who we are. Now, there are tons and tons of actually non-federally recognized tribes here in the United States. Some are recognized by states and some aren't, unfortunately. Those that aren't recognized by by the federal government primarily do not have access to many of the rights and funding and other sources that federally recognized nations do. And there are some other examples currently here in Maine. The four Wabanaki tribes, the Penobscot, Passamaquoddy, Wolastoqey, and Micmac, are currently engaged in looking at the 1980 Maine Settlement Act and trying to pass legislation that would reverse some of the decisions made in that act. That act, unfortunately, took away part of the sovereignty of the tribal nations here in what is now Maine, in Squabanaki territory. And during that time period, during that decision, the Wabanaki tribes essentially became wards of the state of Maine. So they are basically treated as children without parents. And the state of Maine has, unfortunately, used this at times to their advantage regarding certain legal matters and certain matters of cultural practices and lifeways. This is something that has happened in my nation in Massachusetts as well in the past. Now, when we're talking about federal recognition and tribal sovereignty, it's important to recognize too that there are indigenous people in what is now the United States who don't want to be federally recognized. I'm talking primarily of some indigenous Hawaiians who would much rather be independent than be federally recognized. And that is true largely based on their experience being invaded by the United States. Another thing that comes up with tribal sovereignty is not just this right to self-determination, this right to govern ourselves. We have our own constitution, we have our own elections, we have our own governments, but it's also this right to cultural practices and lifeways. You would be surprised to learn that for many Native folks, we did not actually have religious freedom until the 1970s, when the Native American Religious Freedom Act is passed. Prior to that, there were many ceremonies or practices that actually may have been legally justified as outlawed. Another thing is access to sustainable fishing and game sources. We are seeing consistent pollution, consistent threats to our sustainable living sources. Here in Maine, the Penobscot Nation has fought a decade plus long conflict with the state of Maine, and perhaps potentially taking it to the Supreme Court of the United States for their access to the Penobscot River. Just like the Aquinnah Cliffs are a part of us, the Penobscot River is a relative, is an extension of the Penobscot people. And they have fished on this river for hundreds and hundreds, thousands of years in a sustainable, respectful way. And they are constantly faced with issues of pollution and also the misuse and mismanagement of species along the river. We're also dealing with environmental protections. For example, in the Bay Area of Massachusetts, there have been some notions of possibly even nuclear waste being dumped in some places. Places that might actually affect native ecosystems, which we are still ingrained in a part of. And speaking of nuclear waste, unfortunately, indigenous nations have often been, whether it's actually here in what is now the United States, or in some places such as Southeast Asia, indigenous folks have also dealt with this, and as well as the Pacific Islands, have dealt with nuclear waste being deposited, largely by the US Army, in some cases by the Soviet or Russian military, and they have become receptacles, sometimes becoming unlivable. Another way that we have been able to reassert our cultural sovereignty is by recovering languages and advocating for language practices. We speak Wampanoag, and it is a language that has been recovered thanks to the work of Jesse Littledoe Bard and also folks at MIT and a bunch of people that have been involved with the Wampanoag Language Reclamation Project. Today, we have a school, the Wiedemuth School, which teaches Wampanoag for grades 1 through 3. And it also practices a lot of our cultural and natural kind of practices. Additionally, we're also seeking to advocate more and more for our practices and our holidays, which you might call them holidays. We call them ceremonies perhaps sometimes. And this is an issue I run into as well as a public school teacher. I do not have any Christianized or traditional American holidays that I practice anymore. And because of that, though, there are some holidays such as Cranberry Day in Wampanoag that I need to necessarily ask for that time off. It's a time period we've always traditionally used to collect cranberries and be with our community. Strawberry Thanksgiving would be another time period, or the equinoxes or solstices. Now, oftentimes too, we've had to reassert our own sovereignty in our own backyard. One example of this is actually in Mashpee, Massachusetts, where my brothers and sisters of the Mashpee Wampanoag live and have lived for thousands and thousands of years. And there's actually a great book and a documentary about a time period in this, during this time. It was called the Mashpee 9, similarly named after like the Central Park 5. During the Mashpee 9, many of the Mashpee tribal members and other Wampanoag tribal members were actually largely targeted by the Mashpee Police Department, and a few other groups in that area. And unfortunately were essentially exposed to examples of what I would call police brutality, and also just discrimination. And this is something that's true for a lot of Native folks. I've often been told, don't drive while Indian, which is a phrase that unfortunately was shared with me when I was very, very young. That's true for many of us who grew up in this kind of environment, in this culture in the United States today. Another thing I'd like to talk about too is our rights to our children and our ancestors. And I bring this up because I didn't think about this initially when I was first planning to speak tonight, but I knew I had to say something. And this has to do a lot with actually two pieces of legislation that should be known by every American citizen, in my opinion. The first one is ICWA, I-C-W-A, the Indian Child Welfare Act. After a lot of child agencies were actually, unfortunately, placing Native kids not with Native families, primarily with largely white families, in the 60s, 50s, and prior to that, into the 70s as well. ICWA was passed, and ICWA basically makes them go through the process of identifying, are there tribal family that this child should live with? Is there anybody within the tribe that they could live with? And then you go outside the tribe, recognizing that for many of us, I always say I have 100 aunties. And it's very much true. I have 100 different kind of people around our nation who I would not hesitate to leave a child with, a child of mine, which would be the most dear thing to my heart. And that's how a lot of our cultures work, especially here in Algonquin territories on the East Coast. And in a lot of these cases, we want to make sure that child is protected. ICWA is currently being challenged by the state of Texas, who has described it as being racially based. And so, unfortunately, this law could potentially go away. As some of you may also be aware, this is tied to boarding school experiences that happened earlier on. Some went right up into the 90s, in which Native children were sometimes forcibly taken away. So even when we're talking about tribal sovereignty, sometimes we're talking about just the right to assert the decisions that we make over our own family, our own kids, and sometimes our ancestors. So the other piece of legislation I'd like to talk about is NAGPRA, which is the Native American Graves Patriation and Protections and Repatriation Act. I always mix up the last two letters. This act actually was passed in the 1990s, I believe, and NAGPRA was essential for protecting Native grave sites and Native ceremonial objects. Prior to this law being passed, unfortunately, some of us had our ancestors on display in museums. Some of us had spiritual objects on display in museums. Unfortunately, there are still institutions that are not compliant with NAGPRA. Finally, one of the things I'd like to share with you all is something that you can do to address tribal sovereignty in your area, no matter where you are. And that is to do very much how we started off this meeting, which is to acknowledge whose land you're on. Land acknowledges have kind of become very popular, and I use that phrase loosely. There's something that I've been asked to write. I've written some, and I would just like to share with you all that land acknowledgement should and can lead to very authentic relationships with Native people, and there are people that are currently living there today. And this can be done a variety of ways. Brown and Nistic have done a good job of putting together what will be eventually an amazing exhibit. I'm a part of the committee that's planning that exhibit. And to me, this is the example of an authentic relationship. It is an example of we acknowledge this land, but we are also working towards telling the story or contributing in some way. And I always say land acknowledgements are just a baby step. They're just the first step in that direction. So if you are curious whose land you currently live on, you can head to nativeland.ca. Okay, and there's a little hyphen right in there, native-land.ca. It's also an app on your phone that you can get, and it will tell you effectively whose land you're on. And this database is consistently updated. You can contribute to it yourself as well. And they're currently actually working on Africa, and they have some other places mapped out. The Americas are very detailed, very mapped out. And it includes other places. People forget there are indigenous folks in northern Finland, northern Japan, those areas as well. And so I just wanted to share with you all that information this evening. And just know that whoever or wherever you are, there is likely a native folk or native tribe or a native nation very close by. And I think that's important to be aware of, as well as how you can work towards authentic settler and indigenous relationships that respect tribal sovereignty. Kutapatush, thank you so much.
Thank you, Brad. Now I'll turn it to Katy.
Hi, thank you. First, thank you so much to the Just Futures coordinators for the opportunity to participate in this panel tonight, and to all of the fellow panelists throughout this series, and to our moderator tonight, and also to all of you who are present on this beautiful evening. Thank you very much for your shared time and the wisdom of the panelists and your reflections. I wanted to share a story tonight about a lawyer, educator, learning humility, and then end with what I hope is a shared vision for a just future that's grounded in traditional values and knowledge and authentically collaborative work. So central to our experiential educational model, we at Williams Mystic are really fortunate to travel and meet really incredible leaders in communities all along our coast who are bearing the direct impacts of climate change. In the midst of facing dire sea level rise, a steady loss of their coastal lands, their homes, their livelihood, these frontline coastal community leaders make time to graciously share their passion and their expertise with our students, educating and inspiring all of us. They are tenacious, they are brave, and they are generous to the core. And in these coastal areas, all of whom are facing disproportionate impacts from our changing climate, these leaders that we meet with, they share also with us their sense of grief and sadly foreboding for what they thought was the future of their community, what they thought it would be, in a place that is sacred, beloved, and intricately tied to who they are. It is powerful learning. It is a shared intimacy, and it's part of the trusted relationships that we try to forge and honor with our field seminar partners. So here's the story. A few years ago, one of our partners from an indigenous community in southeastern Louisiana, one of our field seminar sites, the chief of the Grand Caillou Dulac Band of the Biloxi Chitimacha Choctaw, who are not federally recognized, they reached out to us and asked if we could work with them to help them assert their legal rights as a sovereign community, hoping to thwart persistent biases and discriminatory practices against their community, which are now hugely exacerbated by climate change. Lack of sovereignty, it's akin to invisibility. And being invisible is heart-wrenching. It's cruel and it's untenable when you are facing the kinds of changes to your environment that threaten everything you know, your livelihood, your way of life, your traditions, your cultures, your very sense of your place in the world. And the Grand Caillou Dulac Band and other Bayou indigenous communities bear this long and painful legacy of discrimination, which is perpetuated by a lack of agency, self-determination, particularly in climate adaptation decision-making, deficient access to robust disaster funding, and true lack of self-determination and sovereignty that persists right now, today. And so as a friend and colleague of the tribal chief, I totally shared her passion to want to work with her to right some of these injustices, to get in on the fight. And as a litigator, I also was anxious to engage and kind of roll my sleeves up and get into the full throttled assault. against these persistent injustices faced by her community. And so we dove into the work together. We had that shared passion, and we were guided by the end goal, which was totally framed by the needs as she articulated to me of her community. But I was guided also by a bedrock mindset of a litigator. And as our training requires, of being a zealous advocate for my client, that all-in mentality that drives my lawyering, it energizes me with a focus on result-driven outcomes. But in the zealousness of my advocacy, I grossly overlooked a basic tenet of the kind of true collaboration that's necessary in these relationships. I never stopped to consider if the form of my zeal was how my client, the tribal chief, wanted to proceed in the case. Yes, we had the shared goal of the outcome. We wanted the same thing. It was the thing that she wanted for her community. And I shared her desire to attain that goal for sovereignty, for agency, for that self-determination. But I didn't recognize that the manner or the process that I naturally leaned on to achieve that outcome was wholly out of sync with just about every single thing my client valued. And it was exactly the form or process or the kind of help she didn't need. In one of our many late night sessions, while I talked through my sort of take no prisoners approach to the litigation, the chief stopped me. Everything stopped. And with enormous grace that still inspires me today, she simply said, yes, Katy, this is painful. This longstanding discrimination that we are fighting together, it's hurting my community. And yes, absolutely, Katy, I share the same burning desire that you are evincing to me for this just result. But achieving that justice, that sovereignty, that voice, it can't come at the expense of our shared corner key values of peace, love, and light. These were their guiding bedrock principles, and obviously, and in fact, the only ones that mattered. And applying those principles to our shared work turned everything I knew about being a zealous advocate on its head. Peace, love, and light, they're not exactly lawyering terms. Honestly, they're not. They don't normally frame the work of a zealous advocate, litigating and advocating on behalf of a client. That is not what guides the zealous advocate lawyer. We don't do our work in absence of that, but that's not the guiding principle. But for her community, a community that was fighting for long-lasting agency and sovereignty for their future, the chief understood and gracefully shared with me that framing our work as a battle for self-determination was not in the long run going to lay the groundwork needed to sustain the strength and the resilience and the capacity and credibility for her community to envision and achieve a just future in this incredibly changing and unpredictable time of climate change. The journey itself, not just the end goal of attaining just agency, had to walk that path crafted from that cornerstone value of the community of love, peace, and light. So for me, I had to set aside the zeal of the advocacy, the zeal of my training, and we have proceeded in our work, grounded in her community's values, and together in that grounding have begun to correct flawed and unjust decision-making, and we continue the hard work to try to correct these flawed and unjust decisions by government and others. We continue to try to work to increase access to agency and meaningful participation in processes that are critical to her community's vision for what a just future might look like in these times of vastly changing environment and climate. And we're doing it in a way that truly continues to honor actual collaborative work. And so for me, I'm still learning how to be zealous, right, in my training for this particular really important advocacy, but it's starting by calling it what it truly is, and it is zealous collaboration. Thank you.
Thank you, Katy. Let me turn it over now to Ernest Tollerson.
Good evening. And thanks again for this opportunity to explore water sovereignty and related sovereignties, I think all of which sorely need a new wave of advocates and champions now in the years ahead. I'm speaking to you tonight from the land of the Lenape, which most people in New York refer to as Lower Manhattan, that territory of Manhattan that was part of the Dutch colony New Amsterdam. And I also get to spend time in the land of the Esopus, west of Hudson, in what people in general call the Shawangunk and Ulster County. So I want to start by asking our audience a question. Perhaps you can indicate if you can answer it using the raise hand function. I'm sort of wondering how many of you have already marked your calendars and are planning to take off Tuesday, October 18th to celebrate an important human rights milestone. Now, if this coming October 18th doesn't ring a bell, it's not surprising. If it doesn't ring a bell, it simply sort of illustrates how low water sovereignty ranks in the world of compound crises, with the existential crises of wealth and income inequality, climate emergency, woefully dysfunctional democracies under attack at home and overseas. All this can be forgiven for not planning to observe the 50th anniversary of the Clean Water Act, formerly known as the Federal Water Pollution Control Act. As all of you are no doubt aware, it's not really important whether you celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Clean Water Act. It's important for folks on the Eastern Seaboard and in the 13,000 plus square miles of the Hudson watershed to assess the state of water sovereignty and then have a long-term plan of action. Like the state of the nation, the level of water sovereignty is not good. The Clean Water Act, signed into law in 1972, envisioned achieving the following goals. Quote, to make all US waterways fishable and swimmable by 1983. Quote, to have zero water pollution discharge by 1985, unquote. And third, quote, to prohibit discharge of toxic amounts of toxic pollutants, close quote. None of those congressional goals have been achieved. Now, has there been some incremental progress? Sure, of course there has. In our region and nationally, gains have been made in reducing point sources of pollution. But when it comes to non-point sources, think agriculture, industries large and small, stormwater runoff from urban and suburban communities, not that much has been achieved. Most of us, if not all of us, are within walking, biking, or driving distance of some egregious example of our water sovereignty deficit, a deficit which hits low-income, low-wealth communities and indigenous communities harder than the middle class, harder than the wealthy. And I want to focus tonight just on three brief examples. The waterfront city of Newburgh continues to get its drinking water from New York City's water system because Newburgh's primary drinking water source, Lake Washington, remains contaminated with a firefighting foam used by the military at Stewart Airport. The firefighting foam contains a toxic PFAS chemical, popularly known as a forever chemical. The timing of the cleanup is totally at the discretion of the Pentagon. It took this ongoing clean drinking water crisis to make it clear that Newburgh's residents, predominantly people of color, lack water sovereignty. As a city, Newburgh doesn't control Lake Washington or the runoffs that ends up in Lake Washington. Nor does Newburgh control its second source of drinking water, Browns Pond. To save Browns Pond, Newburgh and its allies, including Riverkeeper, are working to come up with a watershed protection plan, a plan that would be similar to New York City's landmark watershed protection agreement signed in the 1990s. Note that this first example has quite a cast of villains. The US military in the region, the Pentagon, suburban development pressures that could befoul Browns Pond. Now the second example. In the popular imagination, the Hudson River occupies rarefied space in culture and history, rightly or wrongly. The Hudson inspired painters who became emblematic of the Hudson River School. The Hudson provided literary inspiration for Washington Irving, Edith Wharton, Mark Twain, Walt Whitman, and many others. There's also, frankly, the Hudson River Pier, where Frederick Douglass probably landed when he escaped from slavery in Maryland. Hudson waterfront communities served as stops in the Underground Railroad. Sojourner Truth escaped from slavery in the Shawangunk region. And now, folks living in the Hudson watershed, which is a lot of people, north of 10 million people, are beginning to learn the Lenape, Munsee, and Mohawk words for the river that runs both ways. The Hudson's significance, however, is overshadowed by its dismal ecological status. For some 200 miles between the Albany-Troy region, all the way down to the Battery at the tip of Manhattan, the river remains a long, winding Superfund site. Even though General Electric finally performed one round of dredging in 40 miles of the river above Troy, the PCBs remain a threat to human health and the health of the river and tributary ecosystems. GE's dredging had little to no effect on PCBs below the Troy Dam. Now, talks have opened on the need for a cleanup of 150 miles below the dam, the tidal section of the Hudson, the part of the Hudson known as the Hudson Estuary. EPA is considering a voluntary study instead of a remedial investigation. A remedial investigation would have more teeth. And that distinction between a voluntary study and a remedial investigation is just another demonstration of a water sovereignty gap. And as we all know, it'll be generations before fish from the Hudson will be safe to consume. Third and final example of water sovereignty deficit. New York City's water supply, known as the Cat-Dell system, serves more than 8 million New Yorkers and folks in Gotham's metro region. It enjoys a reputation as the, quote, champagne, close quote, of potable water supplies. A tiny share of it, the Croton system, goes through a filtration plant. The rest is unfiltered. But there's an ugly backstory. New York City's Department of Environmental Protection, New York City DEP, routinely dumps turbid water, muddy water, from the city's Ashokan Reservoir into the lower Sopus Creek, which flows into the main stem of the Hudson. New York City DEP releases muddy water from the Ashokan to preserve drinking water quality. But the release of turbid water shifts the costs and consequences of turbid water onto the backs of lower Sopus communities, farmers, and businesses. The culprit, New York City DEP, hasn't adequately managed the Catskill Mountain sediments that wind up in the Ashokan Reservoir. After a decade of agitation, New York's Department of Environmental Conservation, New York State DC, has just ordered the city to find alternatives to dumping sediment-laden water from the Ashokan into the lower Sopus. Now, these and other water sovereignty deficits in the Hudson, on the eastern seaboard, and elsewhere across the nation could be with us for another 50 years unless we act and begin to see ourselves as citizens and stewards of watersheds, not just citizens and voters in political jurisdictions. The centrality of ecological citizenship and stewardship got a boost last year when New York State voters overwhelmingly approved amending the state constitution's Article 1 to make the right to clean air, clean water, and a healthful environment a constitutional right, part of New York State's Bill of Rights. This new constitutional right, which mirrors those in Pennsylvania and Montana, will only be significant if folks who want to achieve just outcomes for people, just outcomes for ecosystems, activate that right. Perhaps during Q&A, we can grapple with the question of applying a water sovereignty lens to the 2.6 billion New York State is supposed to receive over 5 years for water infrastructure. And perhaps we'll have time to think about applying a water sovereignty lens to waterfront access for passive and active recreation throughout the Hudson watershed. And while this evening is devoted, at least my remarks are devoted to water sovereignty, I did want to give sort of a shout out to one intersectional sovereignty issue we also ought to be focused on in this decade and the next. And that's energy sovereignty, or what many people call energy democracy. So for now, I'll stop there and look forward to the dialogue with everyone on this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Ernest. Thank you, Brad and Katy. Maybe I might invite, if any of the panelists have questions for each other for an exchange, and then I will keep an eye out on the Q&A button to see if there are any questions from the audience. Yes, go ahead, Katy.
Hi, and thank you both for those wonderful presentations. Brad, I had a question, a follow-up question regarding the ICWA, the Indian Child Welfare Act. I think it's just, really awesome that you've brought this to, sort of general attention, and that you're advocating on behalf of having people be more aware of it. And I'm wondering, are you seeing more generalized advocacy with all of the recognized tribal nations in putting the Child Welfare Act and that whole aspect of sort of justice in that realm to the forefront in their communities? Because I mean, that is just exceedingly powerful. And thank you for sharing that.
Absolutely. Thank you, Kate. Yeah, no, I have seen a lot of people, especially ever since the motion out of Texas kind of came, advocating for ICWA. ICWA is something that a lot of Native people from a variety of tribal nations have advocated for whenever it has been threatened. In fact, there is a great documentary, if you all are interested. It's called Dawnland. Dawnland is a traditional name that sometimes you might hear either Wabanaki, Wampanoag, Pequot. We all kind of call this area the place where the sun first comes up. Dawnland, the land of the dawn, the land of the sun. And the Dawnland is actually about how some kids in Maine were actually still taken from their families, even with the passing of Pequot. And so the state of Maine did conduct what is called a Truth and Reconciliation Committee, similar to what South Africa did after apartheid. And the goal of this committee was actually to hear from these stories, hear from these people, and to collect that information and to make a series of assessments to the state of Maine. And there were several tribal members, but also non-tribal members involved from that. And so there was a significant amount of advocacy that came from that, but also it's continued to come from that. Wabanaki Reach, and Reach is usually all capitalized because it's an acronym, is another group that is, constantly advocating for ICWA protections and for knowledge about ICWA too, and ICWA practices. And so each tribe has somebody actually usually responsible almost solely for what goes on with ICWA, just because of how important it is.
Yeah, thank you for raising that again today. It's really important.
No, thank you. And I'd love to say thank you to you as well, and to Ernest too, because you both brought up some very, very important issues, whether it's water sovereignty and energy sovereignty, which is going to continue and continue. Here in the state of Maine, we just had passed today in the House a bill to actually bring clean drinking water to Sibayik, which is one of the Passamaquoddy homes. And so for many, many years, they've been dealing with water that is undrinkable. And so that's been something that I was glad to see. And Katy too, I think it's so important that you brought up like humility and that learning of relationships too, because that is so key to settler indigenous relationships and to like that healing, that reconciliation. So very important. And so I want to thank both of you too for sharing all of your information and knowledge this evening.
Yeah, Brad, I appreciated your remarks, and I have a question for you. But I also wanted to thank Katy for talking about a subject that I think is often hard to talk about, which is cultural intelligence, cultural IQ. Which, if you don't develop it, you can't really have a dialogue with the people you need to have a dialogue with, and make progress in defining problems and taking action. But
Absolutely.
you know, cultural IQ is like really important. And Katy, your story really, I think, brought that to the fore. And Brad, I wanted to ask you, you briefly mentioned Massachusetts and the dumping of nuclear waste in waters off of Massachusetts.
Bay Area, yeah.
Yeah, can you just bring us up to date on that? I mean, constantly what I find when you're thinking about either estuaries of rivers or the ocean right off of an estuary, it's very hard to get people to focus on the web of life in the estuary or in the ocean, because they can't see what's going on there, and they don't, and therefore they discount its importance.
No, absolutely. I have seen most of it on like social media so far. I'm gonna see if I can pull up something right now. And a lot of it has been efforts to prevent a proposed dumping of what I believe is like nuclear waste, but also what just appears to be a chemical waste of some sort. And so one of the things that I know Herring Pond, which is another Wampanoag community, has been heavily involved in, is also the dumping too as well, or the potential to stop the dumping. I'm just trying to pull up the thing right now, but I forget which company has been responsible for that particular dumping, or proposed dumping, I should say. But it wouldn't be the first time that Native folks have been, unfortunately, for lack of a better word, targeted, or Native communities or waterways have been targeted too as well. We see in the 90s, a lot of tribes were kind of asked, you know, given the illusion of choice sometimes to take on nuclear waste. And so I'm just trying to pull it up right now, Ernest, but if I can find it. I can't find it right now, so I'll send it to you later if I can find it, okay?
Oh, terrific, that'd be great, thank you.
Oh, absolutely.
So if I could abuse the moderator role a minute and ask a question, and I invite attendees as well, if you have questions or comments, to please use that Q&A button on the bottom of your Zoom panel. I guess my first question, I have three, and I'll toss one out now to Katy. I was struck, Katy, in your presentation in the juxtaposition you drew between I think the zealousness of advocacy, your training as a lawyer, and the guiding values and ethos of the community you were working with: love, peace, and light. Could you describe in a little bit more detail what your lawyering now looks like?
Yeah.
As a result of its interaction and encounter with a very different sort of disposition.
Yeah, well, the first thing I do is I keep this sticky with me all the time. Because honestly, it is a matter of retraining the how you do it. I mean, we're required to be, under our code of ethics, we're obligated to be a zealous advocate. So it is actually something that we can be disciplined for in the bar if we do not retain and work towards zealous advocacy. But what that looks like for different clients, it's going to look differently. And so while we grounded the sort of the outcome and the goal of the outcome of increased sovereignty and agency, that was grounded in 100% in the value of the client and the community, which is the norm anyhow for sort of this type of work. What wasn't the norm was that normally, clients sort of leave it to you to get there. You know, they leave it to the lawyer to put together all the pieces of the litigation puzzle to get to the result. And in this case, that was so critically important that she understood, well, what does that look like? And you know what? It can't look like that. It can't look like, you know, sort of barnstorming. I had, for example, sort of the idea that I was going to have, you know, this particular, you know, very sort of laser focused evidence and affidavits and all of these things that were sort of really supercharged for this outcome. And she was like, oh, you know, there's a whole different way we're going to look at this. We're going to get to the outcome. But that's not going to work for the longevity of our credibility with the sovereignty that we're hoping to gain. And that was really different for me, because I feel like, you know, these are the tools that get the job done. And now it's like, what, I can't use the tools? And it wasn't that. It was, yes, we're going to use the tools, but they're going to be shaped differently. They're going to be shaped by our value of the love and the light. They're going to be, the words are going to be different. They're going to feel different. we're going to get rid of the edge that is customary for litigators to use. And it didn't in any way take away the opportunity to reach the desired outcome. And we have achieved some of the goals and outcomes that we wanted. And it was really pivotal for me as an attorney, as an advocate, to be thinking about this really holistic process, this holistic way of looking at the practice, a holistic way of looking at the work. That it was, you know, everyone's you have probably t-shirts and sweatshirts and mugs that say, oh, it's all in the journey. Oh, it's super is all in the journey. It's all about the path. And I had before that really sort of felt that the path was, you know, this is the path because this is how you get stuff done. And I don't think about it like that anymore. It is a bigger holistic picture. And when you take the process and you also ground that in the values of the community you're collaborating with, it's totally different. And it's totally what it has to be, because we as practitioners understand we ground the desired outcome and the goal in the values of the community, but that's not enough. How you get there also has to be 100% how the community wants to get there.
Thank you for that response, Katy. It looks like in the Q&A, somebody did manage to pull out the name of the company, Holtec International. Thank you, Betty, for that. I guess that's a question for Brad and anybody else on the panel who might want to answer it. I guess a two-part question. And Katy, you might help as well. So for those of us who are less familiar, what does it take for Indigenous and Native communities to become federally recognized, right? I think, you know, Brad, you opened with the sense of there, you know, 570 plus recognized, but others that are not. So what does it take for recognition? And then Brad, if you could comment on that, say a little bit more about that curious designation of U.S. domestic sovereign nation member. That kind of, as a political scientist, sounds a little bit like an oxymoron of a thing.
Very much so.
And so, first of all, what does it take? And then after all of that, it turns out one is a U.S. domestic sovereign nation. So yep. How do you work within those parameters, which seem to both give with one hand and take away with the other?
That's a beautiful way of describing it too, right there, is give with one hand, kind of take with the other. I've heard tribal federal recognition sometimes referred to as like having your kind of shackle cut from your ankle, but to be weighed down with a weighted ball anyways. And so basically the federal recognition process is quite complex and can be quite lengthy. From my understanding, we were working on it for at least like a decade before we were actually able to become officially federally recognized. And it requires a lot of legal counsel, requires a lot of assistance from both the state and kind of your tribal historic preservation officers. We had to prove, for example, that we have existed in this area continuously for 5,000, 12,000 years. That time period, we had to actually come up with kind of an archaeological record of ourselves, which we know already was there and already existed, but we had to prove it in a way that Western governments, Western sciences would also accept and honor and recognize. And so that was usually the first part, was actually proving our existence as Native folk. Native nations were also largely given options on how to deal with their membership afterwards. And there's primarily two methods that have been recognized and utilized. One's a genealogical record, and one is notoriously blood quantum, judging how much of your blood is Native American, which is unfortunately a very Western concept in a lot of ways, and borderlines for some of us, the concept of eugenics. Additionally, we use genealogy. So I have our family history mapped out till the 1700s at least. And, you know, we know everybody. It's kind of a joke that we're all related in Aquinnah. And in some weird ways, a lot of us are. Additionally, going through the federal recognition process, we had to go through actually a land settlement claim afterwards. And so we actually had to give up territory within Aquinnah for them to agree to our federal recognition. And this includes actually some sacred sites as well, or very important sites. What the first one that always comes to mind is actually Toad Rock, which is a rock shaped very much like a toad. We say that it's Moshup's, or giant, that we often tell stories about. It's his pet toad. And when Moshup left the island, he became solidified. And we actually used to use it as a community meeting center, but also a place where you could leave notes for other tribal members. It was kind of like a post office in a lot of ways. And so we went through the Land Settlement Act and had to clarify what is our land that is being held in trust. So we don't have a true and blue reservation, as the US legal system would call it. We have land held in trust. So the land is still technically within the state of Massachusetts ownership in some way. And so it's very, very tricky navigating that kind of relationship. And I would say for the second question, it is very much an oxymoron. It's very much a strange concept. And because of that, it's oftentimes even like the product of jokes for us. Like, what does it mean to be domestic and sovereign? I think of one scene from Smoke Signals where they're driving off of the reservation in the movie, and one of them makes a comment of, "Oh, you're going to America. That's as foreign as it gets." And it's kind of true in a lot of ways. For example, I saw a person speaking Penobscot on a Netflix show, and instead of saying even just speaking in Penobscot or speaking native language or indigenous language, it says speaking in a foreign language or speaking foreign. And that was like a hit on the head, because I sat there and I said, well, English is actually the foreign language we're going to actually get through here. And so that's another way I think about it often. It's very paternalistic. We are kind of seen as, in many ways, or at least this is my opinion, seen as like the children of the federal government. They couldn't get rid of us, and so they, paternalized us in a lot of ways. And so it is very much so a tricky situation. COVID was probably a good example of it, because a lot of funding became available and a lot of our communities were hit very, very hard. And so we did need to depend on federal funding to survive. It's kind of these illusion of choice concepts that we're constantly faced because of our status.
I'd also like to add, and Brad, you mentioned this with sort of losing some of the cliffs of the lands out on the islands, and in terms of erosion and climate change. The 7 criteria that a tribal community has to prove, includes as one that the community has inhabited a specific area, that their community has been in this place.
Yep.
And the places that they have been are underwater.
Yep.
Many of these communities, there is these preposterous criteria developed by a colonizing nation for these communities to have to jump through these hoops are exceedingly burdensome, but they're also 100% out of line with climate change. There's no way, I shouldn't say no way, but it is exceedingly difficult to meet these criteria in this time without addressing or acknowledging these massive changes to our environment, including absolute loss of land and place. And many of these communities in our United States have been pushed into these fringe areas of these swamps and these communities down in the bayou, in particular in the southeastern part of the country. That land is disappearing at a rate of a football field every hour. And the land loss in those communities is far and away in excess of the land loss rate of other communities that are not disproportionately impacted. So it is just a 1-2 punch constantly. And then to try to achieve these criteria that are, I just don't know what people they're made for.
I agree. I don't know if you want me to address Elizabeth's question in the chat. I can if you would like me to.
Why don't we hold on? We'll turn
Yeah,
to that in a second. Before I turn to one of the questions in the chat, and then I think there's another question in the Q&A box. I wanted to turn to Ernest. When you started your talk, you're like, how many of you are going to celebrate come this August? Like, what have I missed? and I think of myself as somebody who's fairly aware, fairly engaged. And then when you're like, oh, the Clean Water Act. So I'm wondering, and sort of use that comment to, how do we mobilize around these concepts and ideas like water sovereignty, energy sovereignty, when it looks like as citizens of this country, we're kind of blind to the things and the legislation or the ground on the basis on which we might actually organize, unless something happened, right? I think many of us can think back to the kind of mobilization around access to clean drinking water that happened in the aftermath of Flint, right? So major catastrophes, yes, but until such a time. So I'd be curious to hear from you in terms of the kind of work that your group is doing around these issues. You're muted, Ernest.
Sorry. So it's a great question. So one of the entry points, not the only entry point, but follow the money. So one of the things that's come out of Washington that the Congress and Biden were able to achieve was this billions and billions in infrastructure spending. And I'll just be parochial for a minute. New York State's share of that infrastructure spending will be something like, it's scored as something like 2.6 billion over 5 years. So north of 500 million is coming into the state for water infrastructure. So the question becomes, particularly if you apply a water sovereignty lens, how's that going to be spent? Is it going to be wasted? Will that spending get rid of all lead service lines going into homes with young children and into schools, right? Fundamental question, right? I mean, we all know about lead and the impact of lead on the development of a child in the womb, and of course, a child from birth to about age 5, right? Lead is not something you want any child to have to deal with. So, basically, if you care about water quality, you care about the conditions of the waterways near you and ones that you admire and can get to, you want to know how that money is going to be spent, and you want to put pressure on both your local officials and your officials in Albany to get an accounting. Now, I will tell you that, nationally, in fact, I was on a call for this today, the amount of money for water infrastructure in the Biden infrastructure law, I believe totals about 15 billion. That 15 billion is thought to apply against a problem that's more like 45 billion. So once again, the money flows in, but how much of the problem will be solved region to region, since you know that the appropriation coming out of Washington can only address a third of the problem. So that, to me, that gives people at a local scale, a regional scale, a state scale, something to organize around. And of course, what you would want is if the federal government is giving you a third of what you need in infrastructure funding to get rid of lead lines, you want to ask the governor and the legislature to come up with the other 2/3, right? And in a country that's failing to collect taxes from people and corporations that ought to be paying taxes, I think there are places to get the money. So that's certainly one way.
Thank you for that, Ernest. I guess a question to all three of you from my colleague Joy James, and reading from the chat here. Could you speak a little bit more about ways of building alliances between and among Indigenous, Native communities and Black communities based on kind of shared vulnerabilities? I think that's a theme that has come up. Thinking about vulnerabilities related to child removal, foster care, the needs for clean water and land, all vulnerabilities that are in many ways tied and shaped by the history of kind of the genocidal colonial history of the country. So alliance building across communities around some of these concerns.
I'll go first. So this question stood out to me too, because it's something that I'm very passionate about. Martha's Vineyard, we have a very, very rich Black community. We also have a very rich Wampanoag community. There's a very rich variety of communities on the vineyard, actually. And I'm trying to pull it up right now. I have my family lineage thing in front of me somewhere. Just because I'm trying to figure out if it's my great-great-great-grandmother, if it's my great-great-grandmother. Sometimes I flip them around. But there's actually a lot of, not only vulnerabilities, I think, that can be highlighted, but there's actually a lot of strengths too as well. The entire whaling industry, in my opinion, of New England is built actually on the backs of Indigenous, Black, and Afro-Indigenous people. Whether it is, for example, Paul Cuffey. Paul Cuffey, his name is often very much famous and brought up, is a very famous whaler. Paul would usually only keep a crew of Black and Wampanoag or Black and Indigenous sailors. And I think it's important to also recognize that Paul was also recognized and welcome and considered in many ways to be Wampanoag. And so when we're talking about some of these sailors and these whalers too as well, some of them were sharing that identity of being both Indigenous and Black. I think it's my great-great-great-grandparents. It's where the name Vanderhoop first pops up. And if you've been on the island, you have probably met a Vanderhoop. There are many of them in our tribe. And Vanderhoop, many people will point out, is it seems like a Dutch last name or has Dutch roots. And it's actually because the name comes from Suriname. And it comes from when, I believe Edwin, I forget the exact first name, but one of them moved up into the vineyard, married my great-great-grandmother, and they actually had an underground railroad stop on the island. And so our tribe was very intricately involved in actually helping people escape slavery, largely too as being on the island, because we could hide people much more easily on the island itself. And we ourselves had always been enslaved in some way. It's something that we we tried to talk about a lot in our own exhibit we published this past year at the Aquinnah Cultural Center. We now know of at least 2 million indigenous slaves. And we're talking about one thing that people don't know is, for example, why is Tisquantum, or as many people are taught, his name Squanto, but it's Tisquantum. Tisquantum, why does he know English? Well, it's because he's already been in England. He's been enslaved in England and Spain, actually, as well as Aquinnah. Aquinnah was from our island. And Aquinnah eventually is able to convince them there is gold as far as you can see in the vineyard. And the English, being similar to the Spanish and loving gold, brought him back to the island. And when he was within sight of the island, he jumps off the boat and swims back to the island, and there were people waiting for him. And he later becomes a leader on the island. And so I think there's a lot of ways to use stories like this and a lot of similarities. I'm working with Aquinnah and the exhibition committee through Brown Mystic, their partnership, to really help tell some of these stories. The ocean can be many things. It's an extension of who we are as Wampanoag people, but it's also the same water that carried us away from our home. There's Wampanoag people in Barbados, for example, because of the British slave trade. And then, and for many West African and also Central African, because even though many of the ports were in West Africa, people were kidnapped from all across the African continent, brought to West African either castles or slave ships, and made quite literally what I think is the most inhumane experience to ever happen to human beings, is the middle crossing across the Atlantic. And so there are many, many things that the ocean represents: death, genocide, but also in a lot of ways it's part of our cultures, both in West Africa and here on the East Coast of Turtle Island. And it's something that can connect us in life as well. And so I think there's a lot of opportunities for our communities to come together and build very effective alliances, understanding that we often share many of the same struggles, even when it's through different perspectives, different standpoints, and understanding our relationship. Where do we fit in this grand scheme of what is the United States? Where do we fit in? I'm not sure if Indigenous people, or even Black people, or even just Afro-Indigenous people, wherever a part of the long-term vision of the United States in a lot of ways, but we're here and we're still surviving, we're thriving in many, many ways. And it's why I believe there needs to be much more education around both Black history, but also Indigenous history of the United States. I think that's another way to build very effective alliances too, to tell a more truthful history, a real history.
So I guess I can go next. So at Riverkeeper, one of our recent board members is Chief Dwayne Perry of the Ramapo Lenape. And the chief is a moving force behind a new spiritual center in the region, which I think that the spiritual center will end up being a place where a lot of people who are not Indigenous, whether they're Black or Hispanic or people of color, mainstream community, will get to kind of engage with Indigenous communities on the terms of the Indigenous community. And, I can't underestimate the value of having Chief Perry on Riverkeeper's board, because that's essential to Riverkeeper's sort of deepening its relations with Indigenous groups in Canada who have to deal with Hydro-Quebec and the whole battle that's going on now in New York State over bringing greener, cleaner electrons into the state. How do they get there? And are some of the projects proposed reasonable projects when you think about their upstream impact on Indigenous people in Canada, where given demand, Hydro-Quebec might end up seizing more land to build more dams, which would be bad for those indigenous communities in Canada.
And I'll just add a small note and kind of touching back to Joy's question and touching back on sort of like the federal recognition process as one example. A way to build alliance within communities is to have a system within the federal government that doesn't sort of pit one community against the other through a political process. I mean, it's very much a competitive sort of race to be acknowledged, and this laborious task. You know, Brad, you said it took your community 10 years. The communities that I'm working with are in their 21st year. That's absurd. But it comes to the same thing where there's strength in these communities that's beautiful, and to honor the cohesiveness of that strength, I think the legal system has to honor it. You know, this political system that's been created for a time that does not exist now. It does not exist. There has to be a change in that system and in that process and in those laws, because that change can foster and celebrate the diverse strengths of these communities.
Just to add one last thing too, I would say I'm a very huge advocator of actually a national reconciliation commission. I think until the United States has a national federal reconciliation, both to address policies towards Indigenous folks, but also policies towards Black folks, and just a variety of others too as well. Like I was just working on a film actually that's about Indigenous people who are reclaiming and bringing water back to Manzanar, which is actually a internment camp for the Japanese from World War II, Japanese Americans. And it's a very powerful alliance and collaboration between those people who are descendants of the folks who were, you know, in my opinion, very unjustifiably and put into camps, and the Indigenous folks who have traditionally called that land home, but have since seen much of that water diverted elsewhere to go to large city centers. An amazing example of alliance and how alliance can lead to these kinds of reconciliatory moments where we're able to reconcile the past, we're able to tell the truth. You know, South Africa today still has many issues. But at the same time, South Africa acknowledged through Desmond Tutu and all the other folks involved that before they could heal, they needed to tell the truth. And that included victims and perpetrators. And I think the same thing needs to happen in the United States.
Thank you for those responses. I'm mindful of time. We're sort of five minutes from our end time, but maybe I will just share out the two kind of outstanding questions and invite those of you who can to respond to them. The first question is I guess directed at Katy, as you're thinking about. I think this question came up in response to my question about what happened to your lawyering as a result of the encounter between sort of zealous advocacy and love, peace, and light. And then here's a question from the audience was, do you find that you now take that different mode of lawyering to your other clients, not just this community? So that's one question. And the other question, I think Brad, you'd started to sort of comment on this a little bit in your description and discussion of the depth and the breadth of the connections between Native and Black and Indigenous communities and on Martha's Vineyard. But there was a question here about speaking a little bit to, can you share a little bit of how Martha's Vineyard is engaging with the kind of the now reasserted recognition and thinking about the treatment of Black folks in this country as a result of Black Lives Matter, and how that's sort of articulating on the vineyard.
Well, I guess I'll dive in really quickly to your question. I think, yes, there is a shift, in terms of the holistic practice, right? So that it has shifted my mindset, but I think really importantly, it has added more urgency to the work itself, but also urgency to the way I educate and the way we educate. And so educating the future and the students that are going to carry this forward, that to me, passing on that notion of holistic listening. It's not just the ethic of the peace, love, and light, it's the way in which it was imparted to me. I was carrying something into this collaboration that wasn't as collaborative as it could have been. And it wasn't, it wasn't done in a way that it just was sort of an unconscious part of the role of the advocate. And so tuning into how you come into those relationships and how you come into issues that are fraught with controversy, and hearing, really disparate perspectives, but also the way the process, the way the process is carried out, entering into that with a different mindset, I think is really important. Entering into it with a big dose of humility in the backpack, and in your pockets and in your mug, and carrying it with you all the time, is really the urgent message, I think, that I'm still learning, but hoping to continue to learn, to be able to pass that on to our students, as well as carry it in the work. It's the students are the key future. That's the most important thing, is how we can communicate that to our students, because they are everything, and what they take out and away from their education is going to make all the difference going forward.
And I'll talk on the other question too about the vineyard. One of the cool things that's happened in the vineyard, I would say, ever last probably 5 to 10 years in my time. I'm young, so I don't have a whole ton to draw back on, but still, there have been a lot more initiatives from the variety of nonprofits on the island, to actually acknowledge and celebrate the diversity of Martha's Vineyard, to acknowledge that Martha's Vineyard is actually one of the more one of the most diverse communities in New England, and how it has actually served as a refuge, not only for my people, but for other people throughout history. And I think that's something that's very important to celebrate and to acknowledge, whether it's the Martha's Vineyard Diversity Commission, or even just the work that I've done through the Aquinnah Cultural Center in the very short time I've been there. Consistently have people been reaching out, have been working on collaborations that they may take a while for us to unveil. But I think what it's doing is building very strong alliances and leading towards what I believe will be very, very powerful narratives to tell a new history of Martha's Vineyard. A history that's inclusive, and a history that's honest and true. A history that acknowledges our presence on the island and acknowledges many of the people who were brought to the island either by force or by choice, and have since also viewed it as a refuge. During the second Anglo-Algonquin War, which is a phrase I use to actually indicate King Philip's War, which is a very Western way of referring to that conflict, is actually many of our people in Aquinnah stayed in Aquinnah and did not engage in the conflict directly. And so we treated the island like a refuge to hide away. And many, many people, I think, still love our place because of that. Many of you are probably familiar with how much Martha's Vineyard is a vacation spot. And since then, it has largely, unfortunately, become, unfortunately, in some places, too gentrified. for many of our Wampanoag youth and for many, many youth from the global majority. And so, like, for example, it's impossible to find a house unless you have significant resources on Martha's Vineyard. And so it creates some challenges, but I see some really amazing things happening on the vineyard about how to engage with this difficult history. And I think it needs to be engaged with. It's not something we should look away from. A lot of people have had a lot of fortunate, privileged experiences where they're able to look away from some of this. But I think for the people who have called Noepe home, there is no privilege to look away from. It's just our reality. It's the truth. And so we need to accept each other's truths and acknowledge them. And I think that's very important. And I see that happening in the vineyard. And I know I'm part of that through the Aquinnah Cultural Center and trying to engage people in those kinds of conversations. Another thing too that I've been recently kind of a part of too, just to add this in here, is a group of I've been meeting with groups of ministers and pastors throughout Massachusetts who are very interested in how to rebuild that relationship between the Catholic Church and other church systems in Massachusetts and Native folks as well. And so that's another thing that we're looking towards and a way to potentially address the past. And yeah, I would just advocate for you all that have attended this evening to continue to ask these questions, continue to seek out answers. I know that I'm always a resource to reach out to, and I'm sure that the other panelists feel the same. So thank you. Katapatush, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Brad, and thank you, Ernest, and thank you, Katy. Thank you, attendees, for giving us an additional 3 minutes of your time this evening. We do so appreciate that everybody was able to come and join and be part of this conversation. As I said at the beginning, this was the third of 4 roundtables that the Williams Just Futures team is putting together. The next one will be next month, Tuesday, May 10th, on the topic of freedom. We hope to see you then. And once again, thank you very much for joining us this evening, and thank you to our panelists. Have a pleasant evening.